The order came down at 2 a.m. Eastern. Valves along the Enbridge main line to the U.S. slammed shut, cutting off nearly 500,000 barrels per day bound for Trump's refineries. In Sarnia, tank levels froze. On the Gulf Coast, traders woke to crude prices dipping before sunrise. And in Alberta's dispatch room, a new map lit up on the wall. One that didn't end in Houston or Chicago, but at a deep water port on James Bay, where tankers were already charting routes to Europe. Canada hadn't just slowed the flow. It had redrawn the oil map overnight. This wasn't a rupture. It was a prelude. Ontario, Alberta, and Saskatchewan had just greenlit a joint feasibility study for a new energy corridor, a direct route from Alberta's oil sands to Ontario's refining hub. It would bypass the long-standing southbound dependency that's defined Canada's oil exports for decades. The proposed path ends not in the U.S. Midwest or Gulf Coast, but at deep water ports on James Bay, Hudson Bay, and the Great Lakes, gateways to the Atlantic. For the U.S., this was the first unmistakable signal that its largest crude supply was beginning to look elsewhere. Historically, Canada's oil map has always tilted south. In 2024, the country exported over 4 million barrels of crude per day, and nearly all of it went to the United States. Ontario, too far from Western supply to feed its own refineries directly, imported close to 500,000 barrels a day, most of it from the U.S. That meant Canadian crude often traveled into the States, only to be refined or resold back across the border on U.S. terms. This new corridor rewrites that equation. Instead of relying on American infrastructure to reach Ontario, Western Canadian oil could flow entirely within Canadian borders, cutting out the middle link. The logic is transactional. Supply Ontario's refineries directly, reduce exposure to U.S. bottlenecks, and open new maritime routes for global exports. But beneath that pragmatism lies something sharper. U.S. refiners have long benefited from a built-in discount on Western Canadian heavy crude, a margin born of Canada's limited access to international markets. Add new eastbound infrastructure and tidewater access, and that discount begins to fade. Those same barrels that U.S. refiners have counted on to keep margins wide would now be competing at global prices. This isn't theoretical, it's geographical. Ontario's Sarnia complex, home to Imperial's 120,000 barrel per day refinery and Suncor's 85,000 barrel facility, sits just miles from the Great Lakes shipping network. If Western crude can reach Sarnia without passing through U.S. pipelines, the same infrastructure used to distribute refined products could also push surplus volumes east, toward Tidewater. With a single move, Canada could reduce internal transport costs, secure energy supply for an industrial heartland, and carve a route to international buyers. The public narrative is framed defensively. Ontario's Infrastructure Minister Kinga Surma warns of growing U.S. tariffs and rising global instability. Premier Doug Ford is more direct. The days of relying entirely on the U.S. are over, but the details of the plan suggest something more ambitious. By building an eastbound corridor, Canada isn't just protecting itself. It's positioning to compete globally, and that's where the American dilemma sharpens. In 2024, Canadian crude made up 60% of all U.S. crude imports and nearly a quarter of total refinery throughput. Much of that supply is heavy crude, ideal for refineries on the U.S. Gulf Coast and in the Midwest. If even a portion of those barrels is diverted east, U.S. refiners will need to look elsewhere, most likely to Latin America or the Middle East, where prices track much closer to Brent. Margins shrink. The quiet cost advantage American refiners have enjoyed for years erodes. The provinces aren't shy about their intent. The corridor study includes port development, new refinery potential, and even extensions to all-season roads and broadband access for remote northern communities. This isn't just an energy project. It's an industrial strategy. The corridor could eventually link to Ontario's Ring of Fire, a region rich in critical minerals essential for electric vehicles and battery manufacturing. Energy in, minerals out. A two-way artery designed for the next 50 years of trade. It's also a rare moment of unity in Ottawa. Alberta sees higher netbacks for its oil. Ontario secures a stable domestic feedstock. Saskatchewan gains infrastructure that can move oil and agricultural goods east. Each province claims a piece of strategic insulation. And each step pulls Canada further from its historic role as a passive price taker in the U.S.-dominated energy market. Then comes the operational wild card. Ontario's Chemical Valley is currently dependent on U.S.-linked pipelines like Enbridge's Line 5, which alone carries up to 540,000 barrels per day of crude and natural gas liquids from the West. Any disruption, political, legal, or technical, could create immediate supply shocks for Ontario's refineries and petrochemical plants. A domestic alternative would end that vulnerability overnight, and that's where the narrative flips. Though framed as a shield against foreign tariffs, this project doubles as a sword, a tool that can redirect supply in ways that shift the continent's energy balance. Yes, the U.S. would still import millions of Canadian barrels, but not by default. Each barrel will become a choice, not an obligation. And that's the real story, because this isn't just about a pipeline. It's about Canada redrawing its place in the energy world on its own terms. What's unfolding isn't just a new infrastructure project. It's a redrawing of the North American energy map, where geography itself is becoming negotiable. The most striking aspect isn't the steel going into the ground. It's the ports appearing on the horizon. While James Bay and Hudson Bay are icebound for part of the year, advancements in ice-class shipping and cold climate port infrastructure are beginning to change that. These one-seasonal gateways could soon support viable export routes for much longer periods. From there, Canadian crude could flow directly to European markets, bypassing choke points like the Panama Canal entirely. Meanwhile, Great Lakes ports could tap into Atlantic trade routes via the St. Lawrence Seaway, giving Ontario direct maritime access without ever passing through U.S. customs. If that vision materializes, U.S. control over Canadian oil exports would diminish in ways not seen since the first westbound rail links were laid. The market response would be swift. Canadian heavy crude would begin pricing closer to global benchmarks, narrowing the long-standing discount to West Texas Intermediate. For Canadian producers, that shift means higher revenues. For U.S. refiners, it means higher input costs. There's also a quiet irony at play. For years, U.S. energy policy pushed Canada to expand its export capacity, assuming, of course, that most of that new flow would still head south. But now, by developing an east-west corridor, Canada is using that very momentum to create alternatives that compete directly with U.S. buyers. The logic that once served American energy security is being repurposed to reduce American leverage. The project isn't being pitched as a geopolitical maneuver, but the implications are hard to ignore. A country that sends nearly all of its crude to one market remains vulnerable to that market's policies. A country with multiple routes and multiple buyers, however, gains bargaining power. So while the corridor is framed publicly as a move toward domestic resilience, it also sends a clear message to Washington. Canadian oil will go where it secures the best terms. On the ground, the scale of the undertaking would be significant. New pipelines stretching across provinces, deep water port facilities designed for ice-class tankers, and potentially even a new refinery built along the corridor. Each element would require not only capital and regulatory approval, but also consultation and agreements with indigenous communities. The feasibility study currently underway aims to map not just the engineering challenges, but the financial frameworks needed to de-risk private investment, a priority Premier Ford has already emphasized. Though officially labeled as a study, the political tone suggests growing momentum. Ontario's leadership has made it clear the era of total reliance on U.S. infrastructure is over. Alberta sees higher netbacks as a long-awaited opportunity. Saskatchewan views east-west links as decades overdue. In this rare alignment of provincial interests, the corridor becomes more than a contingency plan. It becomes a national objective. Of course, the U.S. still holds substantial leverage. Its refinery network, vast storage capacity, and market scale make it natural and convenient buyer of Canadian crude. But that role, once automatic, is now conditional. In a world where Canada can move oil east to global markets without crossing U.S. territory, Washington's position at the negotiating table shifts. The endgame here isn't just about volumes. It's about leverage and perception. A Canada capable of moving crude east as well as a Canada with options. The corridor may never need to carry enough oil to fully replace U.S. volumes. It doesn't have to. It only needs to exist to shift the conversation. That's the real transformation, because this isn't just another pipeline. It's a signal that the age of single market dependence is ending. The United States may remain Canada's largest energy customer, but it will no longer be its only one. By design, and in the quiet hiss of idle pipelines, a message is beginning to emerge. The flow of oil is no longer automatic. It's strategic.